Joining me now is Her Majesty Queen Rania of Jordan. Your Majesty, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Joy. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is a difficult time and circumstance to be talking with you. As of today, 34,000 people have been killed in Gaza. There is the real threat of mass starvation taking place. And as we know, you are not just the Queen of Jordan, you are also a Palestinian woman of Palestinian heritage. So I would just love for you to reflect for a moment on what's happening in Gaza as the Queen of Jordan, but also as a Palestinian woman, as a mom.
Well, you know, I think it's not just my background, but I think for everyone in the Arab world, we have been quite devastated by what we've been seeing in the last 7 months. You know, as traumatic and devastating as the events of October 7th have been, we can't justify the way that this war is being fought. You know, this is not a normal war. Every war is ugly, but this is humanitarian workers who have seen everything, have said they've never seen anything like it. The collective punishment of people, the displacement of 1.7 million people from their homes, some people displaced more than once. The fact that out of those 35,000 people killed, 70% are women and children. And this conflict, just to put in perspective, has killed more children in 5 months than all the conflicts in the world in the past 4 years. So children have not been killed at this rate in any other time in history. And it's had the highest kill rate since the genocide in Rwanda in 1984. And so there is outrage in the Arab world and around the world at what we're seeing. But also there's outrage at the world's apathy, the fact that this is allowed to happen. Rightfully, after October 7th, the whole world stood up and condemned those actions, but we're not seeing the same kind of reaction towards what's happening today. And we're seeing just people letting Israel violate international law and international humanitarian law without any consequence. And that is creating a sense of disillusionment in the Arab world. And a sense of, you know, how come international law is applied selectively? Why are our lives worth less? Do we matter in this world? And I think that this is really having a paradigm shift in the way we're viewing our world order. As terrible as what's happening in Gaza is, I think the way our world order is today is actually looking exponentially worse.
Well, let's talk about some of the reaction, because you did see South Africa bring a case in the International Court of Justice at The Hague against Israel for its conduct of the war. We recently saw Prime Minister Netanyahu make a statement, a video statement, expressing concern that the ICC, also at The Hague, may bring arrest warrants against himself and other members of his government over the conduct of the war. What is your reaction to that? Is that the kind of reaction that you feel is more appropriate to see justice done? And do you have faith in it?
Well, you know, Israeli officials get very upset when they hear the words genocide or apartheid, and they dismiss them and say that, you know, these are big words that people are throwing around. Now, the International Criminal Court of Justice is the highest court in the land, and they have deemed it plausible that Israel is committing acts of genocide against the Palestinians. And they have since issued provisional orders asking them to prevent acts of genocide and to provide unhindered aid. Now, it might take years for them to come out with a final ruling, but we cannot wait. People are being killed today. History is being written today. And we're already very late, and the longer we wait, the larger the stain on our global consciousness. And the fact that, you know, we're talking about semantics. Is it genocide, isn't it? The fact that we're even debating that should be sending shockwaves in our international community. Who wants to err on the side of a genocide? And those who are attacking the ICJ rulings are actually belittling and dismissing the safeguards that we have in our world to ensure that nations adhere to a certain standard of conduct. So yes, you know, I think it's important the ICC take action, that the ICJ take action, but we don't want symbolic gestures. At the end of the day, and we've seen a change of tone and language from the US towards Israel, trying to compel Israel to not go into Rafah, for example, or to allow more aid in. But at the end of the day, officials in Israel have shown a reluctance to heed any advice or warnings or counsel from allies. So what we need is measures on the ground, to actually say, illegal settlements should be stopped, to say that aid should go in, that we are not going to continue to provide offensive weapons that are killing thousands of innocent lives, the weapons that provide should be conditional. These actions are very important, and the fact that we're going to apply diplomatic pressure and stop using our veto to let Israel get away with things that other nations don't get away with. It's a very dangerous precedent when, and this is what people are very upset about. It's when international law is broken with no consequence, when UN resolutions are ignored or dismissed. What does it mean? What does it mean when international humanitarian law is applied selectively? Or when certain countries are punished for poor human rights records, whereas Israel, which is accused of possibly committing genocide, is rewarded with more arms? Where is the fairness here? And I think this is causing a lot of outrage. And I think we need to just really take a fresh look at the reality of the Palestinians and life under occupation for us to really try to find a reasonable and fair way forward.
Do you believe that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is a war criminal?
It doesn't matter what I believe. I think what matters is what international law says. So I'll leave it for the courts to judge. But what I can say, I'm no legal expert, but what I can say is that what's happening in Gaza today is, when you deprive people and you hinder the entrance of aid, when you adopt starvation as a weapon of war, that is collective punishment. That is a war crime. When you displace an entire population, that is a war crime. When you kill indiscriminately so many civilians, and the whole argument of human shields, that's ringing hollow. When you have a patch of land as small as Gaza, being one of the most densely populated places in the world, and you use an unprecedented number of massive bombs, those 2,000-pound bombs, or the unguided bombs, what is so-called dumb bombs, how can you not kill civilians? And when you say human shields as well, wherever Hamas leaders are, by default, there's going to be civilians around them. So are we supposed to think that that Israel, that is also using AI-generated systems to generate the largest number of targets, prioritizing quantity over quality, really sort of doing away with all the principles of proportionality and distinction between combatant and civilian? They've done away with those principles. Are we supposed to believe that they are trying to avoid innocent civilians? When 80% of the schools have been bombed, 80% of health centers, 60% of houses have been destroyed. Was there a Hamas operative under every ambulance, in every clinic, in every schoolyard? Are we supposed to believe that? It's very clear that Israel has no problem targeting civilians and that they assign very little value to Palestinian life. And the impulse in Israel, whenever there's violence against it, is to punish all of the Palestinians for the acts of a few. So that is collective punishment, and that is a war crime.
We've seen a reaction to what we're seeing on the ground in Gaza around the world. We've seen protests around the world. We've seen them in the United States on college campuses. There are images in Gaza of children holding up signs thanking students at Columbia University and other universities for their support. But we've also seen a massive crackdown on those protests in the United States. What do you make of those protests? And do you think that they will change anything?
Well, look, we can all agree that law and order are extremely important. Nobody wants chaos. And anti-Semitism is a real thing, and it is on the rise, and no student should feel unsafe on their campus. But I think passions are running so high on all sides that we're losing sight of what these students are actually protesting. And we are spending so much time talking about how should these protests be handled rather than looking at what these kids are protesting, which is the reality in Gaza. So I've been seeing coverage of the protests, but I haven't been seeing enough coverage of what they're protesting. We need to face the realities on the ground of what's happening in Gaza itself. Now, at the same time, dismissing these students as, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, or they need an education, or, they're just protesting for the sake of it. I think this collective dismissal is not only patronizing, I think it's quite insulting for some of these students who know exactly why they're out there. And they've looked at these issues. There are always bad actors. There are always people who would want to crash the protests and try to hijack the message. But there are also a lot of people who really are standing for something. And for them, this issue has become about social justice. It's not just about Palestine. They are protesting a discrepancy between a world that they were told should be this way and the way it actually is. They are saying, that, yes, we want you to divest from illegal occupation, but they're also suggesting that there's more to the story than we have been led to believe. That it's this whole narrative that we've been taught about Israel always being the victim and Palestinians, who are the occupied, always being the aggressor, is not entirely accurate. Now, a lot of people are invested in the story. And I think when somebody challenges something that you've been invested with for so long, your reaction is to want to challenge that, to defend what you believe in. But I think, it pushes you out of your comfort zone, and out of your comfort zone is really where progress happens. I mean, you mentioned my Palestinian background. And because of that background, I'm aware of the fact that I might identify with the Palestinian side more. And that's why every day I challenge myself to actually put myself in the shoes of an average Israeli to try to see things from their point of view. And a relative of a hostage, or just an average person who's worried about the missiles flying onto them. I try to think of that. All I want is for people to just for once try to put themselves in the shoes of Palestinians. If it's very difficult to wrap your head around the reality of occupation and what it's like to be a Palestinian under Israeli occupation. To know that day in, day out, every aspect of your life is policed, it's controlled, you're demeaned. To know that at any moment you could get detained or arrested without cause, without just cause, and without any semblance of due process, and without any consequence. This is life for Palestinians. Life for Palestinians, even just the daily commute of a Palestinian will tell you a lot. It's about checkpoints. It's about routine delays. They can't get from A to B without permits and without searches. And it's about nightly raids, military incursions, lands being confiscated, children being taken from their beds in the middle of the night. Israel is the only country that persecutes children in military courts. Save the Children have written reports about this, how children are taken usually from their beds at night. They're arrested and without charge. Sometimes the charge is just stone throwing, and that could land you 20 years in prison. And then they are subjected to a lot of abuse in the prison system, where they are held under solitary confinement, strip searches, deprived, beatings, of course, deprived of their medicine, hardly fed. This is the reality of Palestinians. The reality of people living in the West Bank. So we are told that everything that's happening today is a retaliation to October 7th. Well, if that's the case, why are we seeing what's happening in the West Bank, which is run by, not Hamas, by the Palestinian Authority? 8,000 people have been arrested in the West Bank. Almost 500 people killed, again, without due process, 124 of them children. We're seeing land grabs in the West Bank. We've seen the largest land grab in 30 years take place in March, 800 hectares of Palestinian land. Armed settler attacks are on record high. They're attacking Palestinian homes, burning crops, attacking their solar panels, water tanks, cars. This is happening every day. And it's under full view, if not participation, of the army. Mm-hmm. It's the army that supplies them with the weapons. And the lines between soldier and settler are so blurred, they might as well not exist. So trying to portray the settler community as a fringe community is not true. Many of the settlers actually hold high positions in government and parliament, the judicial system. So their agenda is inseparable from that of the state.
So given all of that, I mean, in 1994, when you're perhaps in university, or maybe just after?
No, I was married then.
Okay. There was a peace agreement that was negotiated between the king's father, between King Hussein and Yitzhak Rabin.
Right.
And it was only the second peace treaty between a country in the Arab world and Israel. And Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated about a year after that. And he was, of course, followed by the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Given the history, do you believe that fundamentally Prime Minister Netanyahu wants peace with the Palestinians?
Well, look, I was around when King Hussein signed the peace treaty with Rabin, and I saw the relationship. It was a relationship of trust between two men who understood that they had to make sacrifices and compromises for a larger vision of peace. I know that they wanted a warm peace. It wasn't just a strategic peace. They wanted a peace between the two people. And I saw how passionate my father-in-law was about it. And we've had many conversations about this, and I truly am very inspired by his vision. And he's the one who once said to me, you know, Rania, you always have to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And I've never forgotten those words.
Right.
It's a simple thing to do, but very rarely are people doing it these days.
Yeah.
And that is the door to empathy. But then what happened after Rabin's assassination is that, like you said, Prime Minister Netanyahu came in, and we gradually saw the politics in Israel shift further and further to the right.
Right.
Until now, there are hardly any peace groups. You know, I used to routinely sit with Palestinian Israeli peace groups to have these conversations, to keep bridges, because I always thought that that was so important.
Right.
There isn't a left to talk to anymore. A lot of times it's like you're either talking to the far right or the extreme right. There's the ideological aspect as well, where the ultra-nationalist Jewish population, it's a deep belief that Palestine is theirs from the river to the sea. And then you have the politics, where Netanyahu obviously has his own political career to think about. And so I think the future generations are not the priority here, and they were the priority for King Hussein in 94.
What about President Biden? How would you assess how he has handled this situation so far, and what would you want to see the United States do? Well,
I just want people to understand that in the eyes of the world, the U.S. is part of this war. They feel that the U.S. is enabling this war, that Israeli officials themselves say that we couldn't wage this war without the support of the U.S. because you provide the arms and you provide all the assistance, and also you use your veto powers, etc. And so clearly the U.S. has a lot of leverage over Israel, and for many people this leverage hasn't been used as effectively as it could be, even though the unconditional support for Israel has for many surpassed any reasonable political calculus. Now, there has been definitely a change in tone and language from President Biden. We've seen that. He is trying to apply pressure. But I think words alone are not sufficient because, as I said, there's a great deal of sense of impunity and I would say belligerence among Israeli officials where, you know, international law doesn't have to apply to them.
But would you say that, you know, there have been protests inside of Israel as well? And so there does seem to still be a left that is very much against this war and also holds Prime Minister Netanyahu responsible for the failures to anticipate the October 7 attack.
Most of the protests against the war are because they want to free the hostages.
Absolutely. Not
because they're actually against the war. So I think for many, if you could free the hostages, then you can go and continue the war. And that speaks to just how far Israeli society has gone. You know, there is an omnipresent, deep, almost cultural anti-Palestinian racism that exists now in Israeli society. So and that is as a result of decades of statements by officials, by government, by media, by military individuals, that says that Palestinians are inherently a violent people, that they only understand the language of force.
Yeah.
You know, and that they are always wrong, and that Israel is always justified in inflicting whatever pain it inflicts on the Palestinians because they have it coming. They deserve it. They don't suffer like us. They don't have the same morality as we do.
So then given that...
And that's reflected, by the way, in the statements that we heard from officials, right? I'm not saying it.
Yeah.
They're saying it. They're saying human animals. They're saying that every single Gazan is a legitimate target. You know, they're saying that these are children of darkness, that they only understand the laws of the jungle. How can it be okay to be saying that?
So then, given that, as we wrap here, are there reasons for hope? Because there's still talk of a two-state solution. There's still talk of somehow there being an after when this war is someday finally over. Are there reasons for hope, given the region, given the heat in the region, and given what you've said?
If I have hope, it's because I believe that the status quo is not sustainable, not for Israelis, not for Palestinians. We cannot go back to the days before the war. That status quo has been broken forever, and it is a status quo that was based on an illegal occupation that fueled fear and insecurity on both sides. It's a status quo that has no political horizons and therefore made the option of violence more attractive. And I know that people roll their eyes when we say two-state solution because they think it's not viable.
Right.
But I think the fact that we're where we are today is all the more reason, greater impetus for us to have a two-state solution. Because what is the alternative for Israelis and for Palestinians? What is the alternative? Are we going to keep going through cycles of violence? Is Israel going to occupy the Palestinians indefinitely?
Right.
Are they going to become a pariah state, an apartheid state? Is that what they're aiming for? Are Palestinians going to be continuously subjugated? Is it just going to be more realities created on the ground? But here's the thing, is when the international community you see officials talking about a two-state solution.
Right.
This shouldn't become a chorus line that officials adopt for political face-saving. Because in the past, you know, talk of peace process and peace parameters and interim phases of peace, these have all been delay tactics and almost a cover to justify continuously subjugating the Palestinians and creating realities on the ground. So while these peace processes were happening, Palestinians gradually and consistency saw their reality getting worse and worse and worse. And so here's another thing I know for sure. Israelis and Palestinians cannot reach an agreement on their own.
Right.
The international community has to put its weight behind it. And that means that you have to be ready to hold both sides accountable. And having a just peace cannot just be about the stronger side implementing its will over the weaker side, which means that we have to understand the imbalance in power here.
Right.
Palestinians have less resources, they have less influence, they have less leverage, but they don't have less rights. Disproportionate power should never result in unequal rights. And we have to remember that, you know, Palestinians are occupied, and the occupied shouldn't have to be negotiating their freedom with the occupier. And yet, whenever negotiations take place, the departure point is always, what will Israel accept?
Right.
What will Israel agree to? Not what's the minimum they're required to do by international law. So if we take, example, negotiations over land, territories that were occupied in 1967, under Resolution 242, those are Palestinian land. So if Israel returns to 67 borders, that is Israel giving back land, not giving up land. And if we take that as a starting point and we work on compromises on both sides, then we can find a situation that safeguards Israel's security and also gives Palestinians statehood. At the end of the day, there'll be no solution until Palestinians get autonomy, human rights, and statehood. And when I say statehood, I mean a sovereign state.
Queen Rania, thank you so much. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.